From the 1720s, a group of violin makers settle in Piccadilly, very close to where Burlington has his London house. You've got John Barrett and Nathaniel Cross at the Harp and Crown, and you've got Peter Walmsley and Thomas Smith at the Harp and Hautboy. And this is mostly a violin by Thomas Smith, who perhaps becomes the most successful of these. His trade cards show that he became and his patron was the Prince of Wales, who was Burlington's big rival in all things decorative and artistic. The head of the instrument is by a completely different craftsman. It's by a man called John Boson, who was the great decorative carver of Burlington's circle. And it depicts the Apollo Belvedere, which is a statue which at the time was considered to be the most beautiful classical statue in existence. The first reason to put it on the violin is because Apollo is a musician, and he's the brother of the muses and sits above them, so he represents not just music, but all of the virtues, all of the arts. And so he is to a great extent, the sort of the patron of music.
So that's raising the violin to effectively almost a godly level in some ways, isn't it?
Certainly in the context here, and we know that in 1719, when Burlington comes back from the Grand Tour in Italy, that he brings with him a plaster cast of this famous statue. And one of the curiosities about this head is that in order to carve it the way that it is, you would have to know the statue in the round. So it seems that it's very clearly copied from that. Now, we're told that that statue was here in Chiswick House in Burlington's time. And also we see throughout the house some images of Apollo himself, taken from the Apollo Belvedere, and also other classical, formalized faces all around the area, which, although they might not be Apollo, use the same prototypes of classical form. The body itself is Thomas Smith, and it in fact has a label in for Thomas Smith.
So that meant that Boson worked on the head with the neck of the instrument separated from the body then?
Yes, exactly, which is how you'd make a violin normally. And this is one of the things. Boson is in Jermyn Street, just north of Burlington House. Thomas Smith is at the end of Piccadilly, so just to the east of Burlington House. They're both within 200 metres proximity of each other.
Because this becomes the centre of a lot of the furniture trade in this area as well, doesn't it?
The furniture trade, you've also got Handel is in Hanover Square, which is another 200 metres away. What
makes it clear that this is Apollo?
What makes it clear that it's Apollo is that when you see the statue, his arms are, his arms stretched out as if he's carrying a bow, an arrow. But in order to be able to, as an archer, in order to be able to see what you're aiming at, he needs to tie his hair up. So you've got a little bit of a man bun. And that, in all other sculpture that's derivative of the Apollo Belvedere, it's that, just as, for example, statues of Diana or paintings of Diana will have a little moon which is there. And actually we can see just behind me in the fireplace, we've got fairly much the same head, precisely so. And we see these little details, like the way that the eyebrows are done, a very flat nose. It's all very much looking at this Roman idealized prototype, and that's exactly what we see here. But what makes this fireplace particularly interesting is the way that you've got the same top knot.
Because it's clear that theorists at the time held the Apollo Belvedere up as being the absolute epitome of everything we reach for as artists, weren't they? And even Hogarth, who was Burlington's great adversary in some ways, in his analysis of beauty, goes into great detail about this sculpture. So there's this feeling of an idealism attached to it, isn't there?
Yes, completely. I mean, I think one of the things that I find so interesting with Chiswick House is I don't believe that we know where the Apollo Belvedere copy was, but you see repetitions of it. You see other images of other characters, also reflecting that the same facial features of it, and it's almost as if this is built as a temple to Apollo, and that Apollo is the central theme of the whole building. And if that's the case, then all the qualities that Apollo represents become absolutely central to this. So to find a violin which is so intimately connected to that, and one of the great things is that we know that Boson was working here, doing carvings, so that's how he had access to be able to do this.
If the central figure in the house is Apollo, then this is a place for the things which we associate with Apollo, i.e. the celebration and the practice of all of the arts, for instance.
John Boson is a carver which, rather like Grinling Gibbons, but of a later time and much less well known. But there's a bit of his biography is actually that his partner was an actress, Mary Norman, and his will shows everything about a marriage agreement without them actually being married. And she, in turn, she's the daughter of Baruch Norman, who's a very important instrument maker. So through this connection, I've always been very interested in his work. And so when I collected the violin, not knowing what the head was, and recognised the carving, went straight to the Royal Naval Chapel in Greenwich, where there's 12 angels supporting the altar, which have got exactly the same characters and facial features. There are some things, particularly the marble images of Apollo, where actually the carving is sublime. And then there's other things which, because of the medium that they're in and stuff, and their purpose, they're not maybe so pretty. Throughout the 16th, 17th century, the viola da gamba, which is sort of the principal instrument of the learned musician, will almost invariably have a head on it. Even in Shakespeare, for example, we get jokes about instruments with heads on them. Certainly with the violin, that gives away to the scroll, partly because the scroll is actually much easier to carve, and also because it conveys the message of classicism much more convenient.
Because it's an ionic capital, presumably.
Exactly. So why go to the trouble of doing a very complicated head when you can just almost saw out a scroll and do it in a fraction of the time? So violins with carved heads as opposed to with scrolls, by this time, are exceptionally rare.
The head does still incorporate if you like, the memory of the scroll itself, doesn't it?
You've got this sort of squashed or oblate scroll, which is, it's there. It's recalling how it works. And if we go to the back of the instrument, you've still got, for the most part, the kind of peg box that you'd expect to see. It just does different things here. I think it is still reminding us of the sort of the classical nature with which the whole thing belongs.
Well, the fire screen you're sitting next to, has got exactly that. You're right.
Well,
next
exactly.
To so that speaks to how objects within the building talk with each other. Not that they necessarily match, but they speak a shared language, don't they?
If you look at classical architecture, which uses straight lines and angles, you can see very clearly where that architecture comes from. But when you look at the body of a violin, which has it has a similarity to the human form, and it's very difficult to look at this curved thing and really see the kind of Palladian architecture or Vitruvian architecture which which you'd see in buildings. We know that that exists. So when Andrea Marti, the first of the Cremonese violin makers, creates this design entirely based on Vitruvian principles
of the body,
of the body, how is he able to convey that to the person who's buying the instrument? So by doing the simplest scroll, which is absolutely a classicizing influence and familiar to everybody as that, I think it kind of reassures the patron, the buyer, that if you can do that scroll to that level of perfection, and they're very perfect, then one can trust all the other claims about the Vitruvian nature of the rest of the instrument.
And it's interesting that you've just referred to the essentially sort of straight-edged essence, particularly of Palladian architecture. You know, there's lots of cubes and angles in this building, and I've just been reminded again of the fact that Hogarth pointed out that the reason he wanted to celebrate curves was that there was no bone in the human body which could be described as a straight line. That was, if you like, unnatural. So it's interesting. There are very few straight lines in a violin apart from the strings, are there? It's
very, very, very few. Even the fingerboard, which looks like it's entirely comprised of straightness, if it's not a little bit scooped. It should look. If you didn't know what you're looking at, you'd look at it and think it's slightly warped. And we actually carve it out to that slightly warped way to stop it from buzzing.
So that has so that's a practical thing.
So there's a practical thing which stops us from having really any straight line at all.
Because that's one of the interesting things about decoration in architecture and also in musical instruments is often, yes, it's pretty, but it often serves a practical function, like the decorative frame on a picture, for instance, or the purfling around the edge of the violin, isn't it? The decoration obviously is only there in the first place because it's doing something.
Exactly. So the purfling, which is the black and white lines which you see around the edge, well, they're very important because you've got the grain of the instrument which is running top to bottom. And if the violin has any kind of a knock, the fact that the grain is bent around this inlay of wood will actually stop any crack at that point and stop it from going further into the body. So in terms of preserving the instrument, it's incredibly important for that. At the same time, outside the purfling, you have what we call the overhang, the edge. And the great thing about having a little bit of overhang is that it makes the instrument repairable, because you can take it off and re-glue it, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't precisely go the way that it did. But actually, the reason why the purfling is black is because, at least with the Cremonese makers, with Andrea Marti right the way through Stradivari, is that they were interested in the internal architecture of the instrument. They wanted to make the instrument into an acoustic chamber. So the architecture applies to the inside space, and then the thickness of the ribs and the length of the overhang beyond that are actually quite arbitrary to what the instrument is. So if you don't have purfling or something there to guide the eye, you actually get quite an amorphous shape, which is not terribly pleasing. And when you're looking at a violin and you're finding it pleasing to look at, you're looking at, it's because the eye is being attracted by those black lines. I'm not sure that it's the violin maker and Burlington having the conversation, because I think that there's a conversation which goes much, much further back. And, to me, actually, the exciting thing coming into Chiswick House is that I immediately thought of, something that's very familiar to me is Thomas Mace's Music's Monument, which is published in 1676, which is a book about viol playing and lute playing and singing, but it also includes this suggestion of what the ideal music room would be like. And there's more than a sense that this sort of square room with antechambers is the kind of thing that he's looking towards. And there's a progression from the 1670s of several buildings which seem to be absolutely, derived from music. And when we see the way that these antechambers work here, you've got this central domed space, which is actually rather like the domed space of a violin, and I think that's no coincidence. You've got this resonant space in the centre, so wherever you play, the music comes into that centre and is then pumped out into all of the other rooms, so that it doesn't matter where you're playing here, everybody can be hearing the music in their own way. And I do think that sort of idea is fundamental to what violin makers were originally thinking about 200 years before this was made. There is this constant idea of producing sound for buildings that produce sound.
When Burlington came back from the Grand Tour, along with art, he brought art objects, in as much as you could describe a composer violinist as an art object. And two of these were the Castrucci brothers. This in itself wasn't unusual. When the Duke of Bedford and Wriothesley Russell came back from his Grand Tour, he brought back the composer violinist Nicola Cosimi. Pietro Castrucci dedicated a set of sonatas, and the title page says Sonate al Violino dedicati ad Eccellenza Riccardo Conte di Burlington e Cork. So dedicated to Count Richard of Burlington and Cork. And I'm going to play the first movement of the 12th of these, which is the scordatura violin, where you have the violins tuned to different notes, with an E and an A at the bottom. This violin was made for this acoustic. It feels that it is at home here. So it's exciting to see what happens when the violinists change, when it goes away from its normal tuning into a slightly more ringing, bell-like tuning under this little cupola here.